in the introduction, except the introduction is really a good summary. Well, there's two introductions, and there are a good summary of the arguments. I did note that in, I think, one of the second summary, it says, the central argument of the book. This is kind of what Norm was saying. Western societies have been making mistakes about Japan because they're using the wrong mental tools, which probably includes the wrong economics, but certainly includes this, according to him, this idea that Japan is in some way basically much like, if not the United States, at least Western European economies. And so he, of course, starts out with a pretty dramatic example, the semiconductor industry, which, of course, started in the United States pretty much, was certainly dominated by the United States in the 1970s. And I guess the Age of Innocence is one of his titles, but that's kind of what I'm saying. We all assumed this was going to continue to be a success story. We had a lot of fretting, I guess you'd say, about how the Japanese penetrated the steel industry and the automobile industry, and, I don't know, cameras and heavy equipment, and not to add anything. But these were all kind of old issues and had been pretty free of import competition in the 50s and 60s, so they were probably sort of hidebound and so forth. But the Silicon Valley was where they definitely weren't that. They were doing everything right, as he says. Competitive. Of course, they had high technology, high-skilled workers. They had flexible management, non-hierarchical, sensitivity to employees, lots of investment in continued research. Certainly should be a continued success, and it's a little strong to say that you had an industry collapse in 1987, but Japan penetrated and became very dominant in some of these fields. Actually, I think this one study said clearly dominant in 8 and a slight lead in 5, but the United States really only had a clear lead 2, according to their figures. And there's another study or two that has somewhat different figures, but they still shows pretty much the same thing. And again, part of the central argument of this book is that it had a lot to do with the deliberate policy of the government, and I guess you could say the Japanese business strategy combined. This example of guided capitalism. Part of the wrong mental tool, according to Fallows, is that we like to think that all of these successfully developed countries like America and Western Europe and Japan are really, the successes of the market system and free enterprise and so forth. And he's saying, or actually as a matter of fact, that Japanese economy is not all that free. It is very much more of a directed economy. It's not exactly what you call a centrally planned and controlled, or maybe it's not even real close to it, but it certainly has a lot of government intervention. And so part of their role in helping the Japanese semiconductor firms is they did restrict foreign investment, that is, the investment in Japan by foreigners, and particularly ownership, and particularly in those areas, in competing areas, and restricted imports, particularly of the chips, the DRAMs, or whatever they're called, work to secure new technology, new patents, the licensing of new patents from the American companies, making them available to the Japanese companies. Actually, he gives an example of them making this sort of deal, I think, with an instrument where they could actually get a factory if they would only get a license all the Japanese companies. And then also they do this kind of supply investment capital, but also kind of direct allocate. I believe the example maybe was Sony, but for a while at least they were not even kind of help them, but they did change their mind. A definite strategy, and industrial strategy, and the Japanese strategy themselves. I just listed some terms. One being the monopolistic price discrimination. I don't think is really in the book. That's just standard economics. What was going on in the early stages, of course, as in any industry, they were kind of settling out as to how this industry is going to develop, particularly things like it's going to continue to be relatively disintegrated, or where they're going to become vertically integrated. The Japanese were already pretty vertically integrated because of these Zaibatsu, and so apparently that was a good feature. It's rather difficult for new firms, new entrepreneurs make these jumps. It's kind of where they start into the next stage, particularly because a lot of them in these scientific areas are pretty much scientists, don't know not a lot about business management anyway. So it kind of takes a while for them to kind of get to the point of selling out to a big firm or doing it themselves and so forth. The Japanese were already set up for not exactly tight vertical integration, because these Zaibatsu are more or less just sort of kind of sometimes loosely formed kind of conglomerates. So they can have different degrees of independence or interdependence in the same kind of organization. And they're always tied in with financial institutions, which certainly help if you're in kind of a price war, if you deep pockets. Some of the American companies didn't have that. And they did seem to follow something that's called monopolistic price discrimination. In economics, the idea of monopolistic price discrimination is that you need a monopoly, so you can charge monopoly prices. And then in competitive markets, you can sell them at lower prices to beat the competition and use the monopoly profits to kind of subsidize. And with all the import restrictions and so forth, they kind of have that kind of market, and they seem to have taken advantage of it. There is, in a calculator war, TI again was, as they say, pricing along the learning curve. In other words, keeping prices going down as fast as they could. And the Japanese kind of outdid them anyway, probably getting below the curve. That is, they had a loss somehow in order to do that. So I might also mention this point that in some surveys, but I don't think they're in the book, that when they asked Japanese firms and American firms what their priorities or goals were, they kind of had reverse order. American firms mostly profits first. Growth, increasing market share were there, but they weren't close to number one. With Japan, it's pretty much the other way around. So the number one is kind of dominance and growth. And somewhere down the line, profits. And that kind of helps explain why they increased their market share. The next couple of chapters, of course, are the historical background. This thing about the factors contributing, I kind of wrote all this down, and then I got to try and check, see where it was. I'm not sure it ever wasn't done in a real one spot, so maybe I kind of cheated here. But I think it's in there somewhere, maybe in several different spots. But it just refers to the fact that over the years, not just because of their religion, but various things, it develops these traits, de-emphasizing individualism and stressing duty to family, nation, race. And of course, a good part of Confucianism is the idea of developing a professional bureaucracy. And they certainly put a lot of emphasis on learning and arts. All these helped them eventually. But it's more really about how the contacts with outsiders sort of convinced them first to go into isolation because they didn't feel like they could control. That's the way Fallows puts it. They either had a choice that they could kind of be dominant and then be safe in their dealings with foreigners, or they had to not have dealings with foreigners. And he does talk about these things like the Mongol attempted invasion and the Japanese attempt to take, I guess you say, control of Korea, which really failed. And and their experience with the Christian missionaries, which, really wasn't like so much forced on them, but they weren't very happy apparently about the fact that the missionaries wanted to change them. And that's what they considered vulnerability. In fact, in these later chapters about the other countries, Fallows talks a lot about whether they're open to foreigners or whether they're not. And it's seems like kind of an odd use of the term, but it kind of means whether they feel like they can resist kind of foreign influence. And that apparently was very important to the Japanese very early. But Hicks also says the arrival of Perry's black ships just had a big impact on some of the Japanese consciousness. So suddenly awakened them to the fact that this isolation primarily meant that they'd lagged far behind the developments in other countries, so they were once again vulnerable and probably couldn't remain isolated and were therefore likely to be dominated. He does mention these things as he calls the uses of isolation, that even though they were isolated, they developed some institutions that were helpful to them. The village schools meant universal education for males at least, pretty low level, but at least like, I guess you'd say 3 R's, pretty early in history. I made a mistake here, I notice. You English teachers can start taking off points, I guess. Where the samurai gradually were becoming more really administrators, I meant to say, kind of government officials, or maybe merchants, and during this period, developed what he calls the cartel-mindedness, that development of things like guilds and early, you should say, primitive examples of something like zaibatsus, just to ensure you didn't get too much harmful competition, cutthroat competition sort of thing. That still seems to be kind of important in this kind of an economy. And with this is the period that Reichenauer calls the centralized feudalism, where under the shogunate they begin to centralize administration and taxation. And he also mentions this, what he calls this standardization of Japanese life, but as I recall, first primarily it's kind of standardization of consumer goods. So all over Japan, you kind of have everybody, seems like they have the same taste, they buy the same things, which I'll take his word for it, I've never been there. But I'm not sure exactly why he thought that was real important, but he did spend some time on it. But at any rate, as following Perry, we got into the period called the Meiji Restoration, which he describes the system that was at least involved is one that emerged for one overriding purpose: to create a modern industry of armaments as quickly as possible. His kind of explanation of exactly how they did it seems to be a little lacking. But certainly, he's talking about this period when they had the new constitution that was kind of modeled on German, Imperial Germany at this point. And certainly did seem to have a national purpose, which is to catch up in modern industry and armaments. And he does mention these steps of learning, control, purity, and proper place. The learning and control are a little easier for me to relate to than the other two, but one of the things they certainly emphasized is getting access to the foreign technology and using foreign advisors, but perhaps you didn't mention that they seem to have been pretty careful not to just have advisors from one country. Englishmen advised them for the Navy, and they had the French for the Army, and they had, I think, the Germans for medical science, and the Dutch for construction, and Americans, I think he said, more for developing university education. And disbanded public schools and said standardized the curriculum and moved it up to a higher level, and started even creating their own universities sometime in this period. But also we're sending a lot of students abroad, and again to various countries. With control, again, it's a little hard for me to get out of his book exactly what they were doing at each stage and how this developed. But this is the point where he keeps jumping ahead again to the present. And it's on this section where he talks about the 19,000 bureaucrats who do all the industrial planning and control for Japan. I don't suppose it started with that. I just don't know exactly how it did start. But somewhere early in this process, they were doing things, apparently, like focusing or sort of choosing a firm or something that they thought had a lot of potential and really helping them specifically, putting the resources directly into that firm. Or maybe an industry, so that it developed this mixture of sort of modern industry, very unmodern industry. And developed saving institutions, he calls it. But he just mentioned things like consumer taxation and this tendency to keep wages down, tolerance of cartels, again refers to the fact that prices were kept up, kind of monopoly level, which all tend to discourage consumption and promote consumption. This kokotai term is really something apparently introduced by an intellectual in Tokugawa period. His name is Izawa or something like that. But he was promoting a kind of a national ethic of leadership and duty, which I don't know exactly again how to put it in terms of, I guess it's something like the idea of USA as a manifest destiny or the white man's burden. But it's always the thing they kind of fall back on to explain why the Japanese citizen has to make certain sacrifices and so forth. It's just a matter of kokotai. Same way with purity in proper place. They were sort of the rationale for the Japanese having to do their duty. Purity, it means sort of purity. I use the term Japaneseness. He said usness. I guess they're equally bad, but it's not exactly racial, probably. It is more ethnic, cultural superiority and purity. But that's very important. That's why they have to protect themselves from the foreigners. And also the idea of getting their really proper respect, their proper place in the world among the world's powers and being recognized. And ending all these humiliations, like barriers to immigration in California, or having a 3-to-5 ratio in the national, the naval conference, so forth. The chapter on the American leaders is one where he apparently, this is where he takes on, I guess, Reichard. He does make some, I think, some good points about how we sort of develop some of the attitudes about the same. We did go in, apparently with the idea, even by MacArthur, that the goal was to move all these old institutions that had been sort of the power blocks before. But as a result of, some of the effects of the reforms, like the rapid development of sort of the communist movement among the labor unions, and of course the onset of the Cold War. After all, Korea started in 1950. They kind of reversed this trend. Got rid of the military, of course. I think probably the reason the military was so easily kind of disposed of is they failed. The Japanese had done their duty and followed their leadership right into the war, and they lost it, and that probably discredited them so much that they weren't really all that interested themselves in going back to that period. But they kind of shifted, the power was vacuum they left was sort of taken up by the, well, government and industry, this kind of leadership, kind of a government industrial complex, which we were more or less supportive of. Made sense, of course, just for recovery, but they really didn't just stop with recovery. He talks a lot about our attitude about Japan, how it changed so dramatically, about their role or their guilt for the war. That, as you said, we didn't just decide to forgive and forget, we just decided to just forget. Didn't have to worry about forgiving. And apparently I would say that he was saying that we found it useful to say, well, we say the emperor didn't really have anything to do it, we keep around, we need to make the Japanese find our policies more acceptable. And it's really kind of hard. I would say I've read some of these books like Toland and so forth about World War II and how it started, and it's kind of hard for me to see exactly how much influence the emperor really could exert on his own, one way or the other. But at any rate, that's what we did. We, in a sense, kind of rigged the war crimes trial, so that it would only be people like Tojo and so forth that were going to take the blame for everything. And certainly that was useful for Japan. We sort of helped them assuage their guilt by dropping 2 atomic bombs on them. And I guess they may have found that useful too. It's kind of a high price to pay, I suppose. He does make a kind of an important point here too, that as a result of this period, they've kind of developed into a one-function country, I suppose, where their big concern is economic strength, gaining development of the economy, and economic strength in world markets. He kind of says they delegate their military and foreign policy in the United States. They don't necessarily delegate all their foreign policy in the United States, but they have played this active role in those, in even the foreign policy arenas they have in the economic. And they tend to be supportive, I guess, generally of the United States, especially during the Korean War and so forth. And he even has this quote by Yoshida about sort of deciding that they should be a U.S. colony so that they could then be able to outdo the United States, not like England did. I mean, the United States did with Great Britain. They were a colony. Then you get this final, not really final, but the next chapter about the economics, particularly the contrast between what he calls Anglo-American economics and I guess what you could call Friedrich List economics. He has a lot to say about how hard it was for him to find out anything about Friedrich List, and I understand, I don't know much about him either. He's just not a very well-known economist, except in Germany where he's kind of a hero. And he's kind of a hero because his principles of political economy, I think, is about how Germany has developed their industry. And he also was, promoted the unification of Germany and very much, I guess you could say, probably helped a lot, planning policies for economic development. So I just can understand what other countries like Japan would find perhaps helpful. I don't know that he has determined for sure that the Japanese really read Friedrich List a lot, but at least he would be a good choice. The Anglo-American economics is kind of basically, what he says about it is basically correct. That the way success is defined is by the maximization of consumer well-being. By this, you don't necessarily mean that the idea is for everybody to be a high consumer. We're just talking about personal well-being. In fact, Jeremy Bentham called it human felicity. Just maximizing, making people better off. That's the goal. But we are individualistic. Our sort of definition of the state, the Anglo-Saxon, is that it's composed of individuals. And that's the idea. Adam Smith's wealth of the nation. The wealth of the nation is just the wealth of the individuals. The old idea, really, in monarchy and what we call the period of mercantilism, and in Europe more the England and in fascism and so forth is what's called the corporate state, where the individual is just one of the cells of the body. It's the state that has the interest. And success is somehow strengthening the state, and the individual is supposed to play a part. That's just a different philosophy of government. And Frederick List wouldn't fit us very well at all. Adam Smith fits us better. He does say things like the Anglo-American views failed the test of history. Actually, we haven't really been very devoted to free market economics throughout our history anyway. It didn't start out that way. The United States was born about the same time Adam Smith published his book. Didn't have all that much influence at first. And then, of course, after World War II, we would have to say we ourselves kind of were flirting with ideas like government intervention and planning. It's really on the last couple of decades where you can say that the conservative free enterprise people have kind of seized political power in the United States. Talk a lot about it at least. And of course, Adam Smith type economics supports it. But we haven't been very consistent about it. In fact, I would say the same for both England and the United States. When you get into the political arena, we're much more pragmatic than ideological anyway. And I would say we're still that way today. We talk a lot about what the government can do for the economies to get out of it, except with all these exceptions. Something goes bad, including floods. The government has to do something. You can't become laissez-faire at all, that I can see. And particularly the federal government has to do something. But at any rate, we did develop with some government promotion, and so did England, and so most countries, particularly not having a totally free trade, having import protection. We're not even set up, though, for the kind of sort of controlled by a relatively small group, like Japan is, and I guess probably Germany was. We just have this totally different kind of society. I can more easily imagine our industrial policy being controlled by 19,000 lobbyists and 19,000 bureaucrats. That's just the difference in our system. But at any rate, that's one of these ideas that American policymakers and business leaders have always made errors because they're assuming somehow Japanese policy is just devoted to the same things ours is, or it should be, or it's going to be pretty soon. And we hear this sort of like every few years. The new generation of Japanese, the young people, they're going to be high consumers. Don't know whether they are or not, but they haven't been for several generations. That's, by the way, one of the problems of getting old. You notice everything stays the same or it comes back. Just when you think it's gone, and then it comes back. At any rate, the final point I'd like to make on this topic is that Japan has certainly been a leading example of deliberately developing an economy. And they're not the only one. Imperial Germany did the same thing. There have been a lot of failures. I guess we could say certainly Italy had, in some sense, a similar experience and tried to follow Germany's lead and never did very well until here very recently. But it's been at a price, particularly what we'd consider a price. Japanese have had and still have these really high prices. They can buy their own goods cheaper outside of Japan than they can in, except you can't bring them back in probably. But, and they have pay high taxes. They have very high land prices, of course. Their wages are kept low. He may exaggerate that a little bit. He says one of the advantages is they get a lot of jobs, but then they have artificially low wages for the same jobs as they would have in other countries. And of course they have high saving and therefore low consumption, standardization of goods, and they don't get to import many goods to provide variety. And what do they get in return? Well, maybe it's not quite as bad as I say, but they do, at least with their high saving, they usually build up pools of assets, but that's one of the problems with their recent problems with the stock market and the real estate markets. That's where a lot of their assets were. And again, it's like suddenly the system, which was paying off in that term, may be failing them, and it may have some effect on their attitudes, I don't know. But anyway, they have been successful in sort of maintaining the home market as a sort of protected monopoly so that the business firms can go out and compete better in foreign markets. They do this nice thing to us of sending us a lot of their goods and not taking any of ours much back in exchange. And with what's kind of what they save, I guess, they often invest in our country, our assets. So I don't know, maybe we should be thanking them instead of worrying about them. At least that's more standard economic point of view than what Fallows is proposing. And then finally, I don't think I may have much time for it anyway, but he does get into this thing about the emergence of the Asian system, these countries that Anwar is going to talk about more anyway. He does have these three miracles. It was kind of interesting about their rapid development in the 19th century up to World War II, and then their rapid recovery, the other economic event. The third one is their survival in a way that had a dramatic change for them. It was the rise in energy prices because they had to import all their oil, along with a rise in the yen, which tended to overprice their exports, which they countered at least a great part by shifting their manufacturing into these low-wage Asian countries. And that's part of how they came to be the leader of the Asian system. I may have taken too much time. I kind of lost track of when I started, actually, but hopefully it left some